Hello, I wanted to post a video here about my top 3 choices for vintage dip pen nibs for a beginner. Let's be clear about what we're not talking about. We're not talking about calligraphy or fine script or anything like that. We're talking about nibs that can be used for everyday purposes. Many of these nibs were business nibs or correspondence nibs in their day. I've got some criteria that I've outlined here to narrow down my top 3 choices. The considerations were availability, price, maybe I'll just move this over so you can see, availability, price, quality, what I'm calling the user experience, or in other words how the nib feels as you're writing, and line characteristics. So I've tried to choose one of each basic type of line. Now all 3 of these nibs are Esterbrook nibs. I have other brands as well, but the Esterbrook company was a very prolific nib maker, and so even today you can find their nibs fairly inexpensively, especially these 3. So we'll be talking today about the 788 oval, the Jackson stub nib number 442, and the Falcon 48 number 048. I'll be doing all the writing samples in Parker Quink. Just to keep it simple, use one ink, and this is a good ink for dip pens. Even though it's made for fountain pens, you'll find it to be perfectly adequate for dip pens. All 3 of these nibs can be purchased either individually, or if you can find one of these assortment number 11s, it has all 3 of these nibs plus one more, which I think is a school nib if I remember right. I'm going to give you some alternatives to each of these 3 as well, just very briefly. There's the Spencerian number 20, which is a dome nib. You'll notice it looks exactly like the Esterbrook 788. To the Jackson stub, the alternative I would present is the Subway stub from Spencerian. Now, this particular version is one that they call silverine, and it has this kind of, I don't even know what the coating is, but it's got this coating on it, plating of some kind, and I actually find that this nib writes a little more smoothly than the Jackson. I actually prefer it over the Jackson, but this one is very, very available, which is why I'm using that. And third, the Falcon 48. There's, I think every pen maker that ever made a pen made a copy of the Falcon 48, so finding multiple versions of that certainly would not be hard. So as we talk about these, I'd like to show you how you would use each nib, how you would hold it to the page and write with it. Most of them will probably be pretty obvious to you, but might as well start from the beginning. So the oval point is called that because it has this turned up tip. I don't know if I'll be able to focus enough to see it, but the tip of this is turned up, which makes something of a ball at the end of the nib, kind of like a ballpoint pen of sorts. So the reason I'm putting this one in first is because it is the easiest to use. You can move this nib in almost any direction without catching. Sometimes it might catch on one of these 2 strokes if the tines are misaligned, particularly as this one seems to be at the moment. But you'll be able to use this nib with a lot of ease, even if you're not experienced with dip pens. So again, all 3 of these nibs, none of them are exotic or fancy or whatever. But if you're just looking for any nib that you can write correspondence in, that you can do journaling in, that you can take notes for school in, any 3 of these would be perfectly adequate for that. They're all inexpensive and available. You can probably get any of them for under $1. Alright, so just a quick writing sample. The oval 788, you can see, does not have a significant line variation. If I do this little flourishy thing there, this portion of the line and this portion of the line are all the same. So let me just write the name of the nib here. So especially on the push stroke, which is where a lot of dip nibs will catch, I can write without issue with that 788 nib. Not sure where I put my rag, so we'll just set that aside right there. The second in the order of ease of use I debated about, but ultimately I decided to put the Jackson stub, just because it's not as sharp as the Falcon 48. So the globe point, as I said, or the oval, has a round ball at the end. A stub nib is an italic nib or a stub nib, are interchangeable terms. Instead of a ball, you've got something like a chisel point at the end of the nib. And this means that a stroke this direction is going to leave a narrow line, and a stroke this direction is going to leave a fat line. And so it allows you to have a little bit of character or line variation, which I will show you like this. Here's, and you generally would hold these at a 45 degree to the corner of the page, and you need to hold the nib properly or it's not going to write. So think of this again as a chisel. So you need this to be resting on the page like this. If you're writing on one of the edges of the chisel, then it's not going to write, and it'll maybe skip across the page and chatter a little bit. As you can see, there's one side and here's the other, and it doesn't write. But if I lay it flat, it'll write in all directions. So you've got to hold a stub nib correctly. Now, they're harder to use than a globe point because they're not rounded. An oval point, I keep using the term globe, but they're interchangeable. They're not rounded like a ball, and so you have these sharper edges that can catch on the page. So you got to be a little more aware of how you're holding the nib and how you're writing with it. So again, a 45 degree angle with the point of the nib generally pointing to the front of the page and holding the chisel point flat against the page. The quick test to tell you if you're holding your jacks or your stub correctly is to draw an X. An X should give you 2 line widths. A plus should give you 1 line width. As you can see, there's not significant variation in that, and there is there. That means that I'm holding this nib correctly. So we'll just write the name for this. I'm kind of out of ink. I'm not putting a full dip on these, as you'll see in a minute. Now that pen was loaded pretty heavy. I didn't wipe the tip, and so you lose some of the variation there as the line, as you've got a lot of ink on the page. Didn't put a guard sheet down, so I may have, let me just fold this up and we'll have a guard sheet now. Alright, now let's lastly look at the Falcon, the 48 Falcon. This is also by Esterbrook. It's nib number 048. You'll notice it comes to a very pointy tip. This isn't by any means the pointiest of nibs that you will find, but it is a sharp pointed nib. It's got a really unique shape to it. They called this the Falcon design. You'll see a lot of pens with it. It is going to create the finest line of all 3 of these pens. And while I wouldn't say that this is a flex pen per se, the nib does offer you some flex. Flex is when those tines open up with pressure. Let me see if I can get it to focus. Kind of. You can see those tines opening up as pressure is put on them. And what that does is that allows the line to be wide and then fat and wide and fat. I wouldn't worry too much about that if you're just learning, but it will allow some character in the writing, kind of like a stub does. As you're writing, you'll naturally bear down on a pulling stroke, and that will give you some varying thickness in the line. Now the other thing about a nib with a sharper point that isn't turned up is you've got to be particularly careful on these pushing strokes. This 48 nib is really not all that bad, but especially if you're working with paper that is less forgiving, you might catch the tine as you're going up, something like this, and it can splatter ink over and potentially ruin your nib. So let's put a quick writing sample here of the Falcon 48. So you can see some line variation, especially in some place like right here, or maybe right here on that N. Let me maybe try to again get that up and focus a little bit. There you go. And that's just from writing. I wasn't per se trying to put flex into that, but you'll find that happening naturally. The nib is capable of giving you what I will call a moderate amount of flex. And so it can provide some character and make your writing interesting. It's also capable, if you want, of quite a fine line as well. Just depending on how much pressure I'm putting on the nib. This was a business pen in its day, and quite a popular one at that. There may have been more Falcon 48s produced than any other nib. I don't know that for certain. I wouldn't be surprised to find that. It's certainly probably in the top 10 common nibs of the day. Now, the last thing I wanted to show you was how much ink each of these nibs holds, relatively speaking. So I used one sheet of paper and one phrase, the quick brown fox, over and over. Here's the oval 788. Now the way I did this is I would dip each nib clear up to the top. I did not wipe the nib, so you'll have some kind of heavy writing at first, like here. But the idea was just to load up the nib and see how far I could write the same phrase over and over before the nib ran dry. So the 788 allowed me 8 lines on this half sheet. The Jackson stub allowed me 7 lines on the sheet. In case I was out of frame, there's the oval and the Jackson. And the Falcon 48 surprised me. I honestly thought this would do more than the others because it is a finer line. But there you go, 6 lines. If you're interested in getting started with these, do some reading on how to prepare your nib. When you first get it, it'll have a coating on it of some kind of wax or oil or something, varnish maybe, to protect the nib. And so you'll want to clean that up a little bit. Otherwise, what tends to happen, let's just maybe see if this will work. I've got a brand new oval 788. I dip it in there, and as you can see, there's no ink on the nib, whereas if I take my used oval 788 and dip it, it holds the ink beautifully in the nib. So do a little bit of reading on that, but you just clean it either with a solvent or something like that, alcohol, or I'll often just use alcohol. It also will wear off over time, but you may choose to hasten the process a little bit by cleaning it up. Alright, so there's my top 3 choices for the beginning dip pen user whose intention is letter writing, journaling, note-taking, whatever, i.e. nothing fancy, no Spencerian type of script, just your average, everyday, common writing. I think you'll find hours and hours of enjoyment out of any 3 of those nibs, and you can have any of them very inexpensively. Thank you,